Hello, hello. Oh, yes, now it's working. Good afternoon, everyone. First, thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks to the PCCB for hosting us. We've been working with PCCB since many years, and specifically on finance. That's the third event we are having together. Thanks also to our experts, our panelists that will join, and especially to all of you that are taking your time to be here with us today. So the idea today is really for us to have a discussion, an exchange, and learn from each other. So I'll be very brief in the introduction, and also later colleagues will come to set a little bit kind of like the tone and get ourselves warmed up for some interesting discussions. So just to set the frame on the partnership and what we are and what we are doing. So the partnership was launched 1 year after the signing of the Paris Agreement. Actually, the discussions to create the partnership started during the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and the idea was to bring a strong group of countries, developed and developing countries, and international organizations to provide support to countries in implementing the NDCs, especially with the recognition at the time that the NDCs we had were not enough to achieve the targets that the global goals of the Paris Agreement, but also the realization that the resources that were available to support countries in this trajectory were not enough. So we needed to work together, and we still need to work together and collaborate to be able to generate some meaningful impact. So we are driven and created by countries and for countries. So we have currently 130 countries, both developed and developing countries, and approximately 100 international institutions. And that's where the power of the partnership it lies. It's one, this very broad network of countries, developing countries and developed countries, but very importantly also the expertise and the knowledge that our members bring to the table, and they are the ones providing the support to countries based on the requests that they communicate the partnership. And today we are very, very pleased to have three of our distinguished members, ADB, which is also sitting in our steering committee, the Commonwealth, and the Adaptation Fund that just joined, and we are very, very thankful for that, and really looking forward to continue collaborating with you all. So, I mean, we've been here already. Today is a Finance Day. We know that we have to step up in many ways in terms of climate finance and adaptation finance. We have challenges in terms of quantity. So globally, adaptation flows are very limited. And we are very far from reaching, according to CPI estimates, around 30% of the needs, but with the recognition that there are a lot of uncertainties in these numbers. And on top of that, we have also the impacts of climate change that we are seeing across the globe, and are growing by the day. So it's an area that is super relevant. It's an area that is more challenging to mobilize finance, and it's an area that we will need to do more and more over time. We also have many challenges in terms of, let's say, broadly speaking, the quality or the type of the adaptation finance that we are mobilizing. So a lot of the adaptation finance is not necessarily adequate for many countries, especially low-income countries, SIDS, but also many other emerging economies, really, really super reliant on loans, public loans, majority of it on market rates, and very limited mobilization of private sector or leveraging of private sector with these resources. At the same time, also there is let's say, a big challenge in terms of moving from project by project or really discrete interventions to more transformational interventions, and being able to evaluate and see how we can do better in terms of mobilizing resources and capacities at the national level also to prepare, develop, implement, and evaluate financial flows. And then, of course, all the challenges that we have seen in terms of speed in accessing climate finance, in disbursing climate finance, and a lot of movement happening in this space in the context of the MDBs, in the context of the multilateral climate funds, but also in the context of the private sector, and how we can bring more resources to this challenge and collective challenge that we have. So I would like to share a few statistics of the partnership or numbers that we have. So we are currently working in 90 countries, more than 90 countries. It's growing by now 98, according to the last count. And by working, I mean countries that came through the partnership with specific requests and areas where they want assistance. And of those, 67 countries have requested support on adaptation. Approximately 1,700 requests. So we are talking about a quite substantial number of requests coming from countries in this space. The types of requests vary significantly from upstream in terms of policy, strategies, legislations, to developing of projects, creating financial instruments, and also implementation of the projects and being able to evaluate those projects. A few areas that I would like to highlight. The first one, the most requested area for support, is on developing projects and pipelines. So countries really want to shift towards implementation. And for that, you need to have strong projects that can deliver on that. A second one, which is quite interesting in terms of developing and updating monitoring evaluation systems. So this involves in terms of even like collecting the data, understanding like the impacts, understanding where and how to invest, but also later on being able to evaluate the investments and improve those over time. And then as we are in the PCCB, I think interesting to also mention that the third most requested area for support is on developing capacities. And this covers a wide range of topics. First, developing the plans, the investment plans, the national adaptation plans, the projects themselves, the implementation of the projects, the evaluation, support to ministries of finance, central banks. So there's a very wide range of requests on capacity building, but almost all countries that request support to the partnership, there is a very strong component in building in-country capacities specifically. Another thing that I wanted to mention very briefly, 500, or most of the requests are not sector specific, so it lends to also this kind of like overarching programmatic approach, setting the foundations that will affect the different sectors. That's one. And it comes to specific sectors. We are talking about mainly water, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and oceans and coasts. And one interesting trend that we have been seeing is that countries that traditionally are more like mitigation oriented, we have seen more requests also labeled or perceived as adaptation, or like not only the dual benefits, but specifically adaptation. So transport, infrastructure, and waste are some that stand out in this direction. So the challenges are great, the needs are bigger, and for that, and to try to help countries, especially the member countries, to articulate and communicate their priorities to us, we have put together with our members and also in collaboration with the GCF what we are calling the Climate Investment Planning and Mobilization Framework. The idea is really to be iterative, is something that is flexible, that is adaptable to each country. And the main objective is to help countries to reflect where they stand, where they want to go, and how can they do that like in the way that optimize the resources they have. And there are a few things that I would like to highlight in terms of the framework and the objectives of the framework. So first, a very strong focus on building institutional capacities and fostering coordination, so trying to make this in an integrated way with ministries of finance, with ministries of planning, with the sectoral ministries, so not do it like in siloed approach, but integrated. The second one, which is very, very much related to it, is the mainstreaming component into planning, budgeting tools, the mandates and like financial regulation and supervisory requirements, for example, from central banks. The third one, which is a very important topic and came very strongly in especially the discussions with the GCF, is how to make those projects and those programs more based on evidence. So very clearly, what is the trajectory, what is the vision, where the country wants to get, how they want to get there, but very importantly, what are the impacts, both in terms of climate, but also the connection with development, and then using that information to prioritize and to set where countries want to go. Another element that very strongly emphasized in the framework and the experiences is to really have a very wide focus when it comes to mobilize resources. So not only looking at purely public finance, as we had historically seen a lot of focus on, let's say, the funds and specific lines, but really looking also into private sector as well and bringing the private sector early on in the process, blended finance and other instruments. And then finally, very importantly, also to track, to be able to evaluate and to disclose the results so that continuously it can be improved. I won't go into the details of the framework, but this is something that we have launched with the GCF at the last COP, This year we have consulted, continued consultations with our members, with the private sector, really to try to get the inputs and make it more fit to the reality of the countries and our members. And we'll be launching soon a revised version, which is very much the same structure, but it has kind of like elements that were emphasized that we should put more focus on. So for today, as I mentioned, our main objective is to, one, learn from each other and see how this programmatic approach and this integrated approach in terms of climate, looking to both mitigation and adaptation, could be beneficial to countries, is to share practices, experiences, challenges amongst each other, but very importantly also to think about the capacities and how we can build these capacities, but what we need to do more. And for us as a partnership, that's always something that we are very attentive to understand which areas, what are the gaps, and how we can be fit for purpose and bring more value to the system. So we'll have, before we go to the group discussion, we'll have like a pitch from experts. And the idea is really to set the tone and to get our engines going, so we'll go into the discussions. So for that, I would like to first start by inviting Argu. So Argu is the principal climate change specialist at the Asian Development Bank. He leads the ADB's climate adaptation priorities and targets and support client governments in strengthening policies, plans, and investments. Has more than 20 years on international experience in the field of climate and disaster resilience, especially in the context of urban resilience. Argu has also been leading the climate adaptation investment planning process in the NDB, and it's like a really kind of like a leading voice in terms of the matter, and has a very strong experience. So Argu, if you can come in and just sit with us here. I would like to next invite Bianca. So Bianca is a climate change specialist in the Adaptation Fund. First, thank you very much, Bianca, for all the supporting, like getting the Adaptation Fund now as a member of the partnership. We are very thrilled with that and really looking forward to collaborating with you. So Bianca is in the Adaptation Fund's Country and Partnership Unit, where she is coordinating the fund's resource mobilization and strategic partnerships. She has over 11 years of experience in international climate diplomacy, policy, and finance, with a focus and passion on enhanced access to finance for vulnerable developing countries and communities. Bianca, please welcome. And then last but definitely not least, Uzo. So Uzo is advisor on climate change at the Commonwealth Secretariat and provides strategic leadership and technical expertise to drive the implementation of the Commonwealth Climate Change Program, including a flagship Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, which is embedding advisors in several countries across the globe. And she's also guiding, supporting countries in the attainment and advancement of the design, but also very important, the implementation and finance of the NDCs. So welcome, Uzo. Please join us in the podium or in the panel. So thank you very much again. So to get us started, I would like to start with you, Argu. And you've been working on climate adaptation investment planning for many years and has been seeing the realities on the ground, the challenges, but also the way forward and the things that are important to consider as countries navigate this process. So if you could share with us kind of like the key elements that you think it's important to have in mind, and especially what are the elements that can support countries in this process to be more effective in mobilizing resources, of course, from MDBs, but also from different financial sources. So.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. I'm not particularly very good at making pitches, so I would rather keep it very simple. Imagine you're a country. You have recently developed your national adaptation plan, which is a very comprehensive plan. You have costed it, and we have said, okay, you need every year $1 billion to finance that, implement the plan. But you need that $1 billion every year between now and 2030. That's what you have set in your plan. So now you need to make sure there's money flowing to help you implement it. You have looked at all potential sources of financing, including global climate funds, MDBs, bilateral partners, and including a domestic budget. It ranges to around 100 million. So you still have a gap of 900 million to finance every single year. That's number one. Number two, you want to make sure the 100 million that you have is actually predictable, that every year you're getting that 100 million. It is affordable. So how do you deal with this challenge? Making sure finance that you have is predictable, affordable, and is able to fill that big gap. And this, I think, is the struggle that most, at least developing countries in Asia Pacific, are facing. 1 billion a year is perhaps a very conservative number, I'm saying. Most countries need much, much more than that. So this is the question that at ADB we've been asking ourselves, that if we are being asked to do more on adaptation, how can we make sure our limited resources that we have, in most cases concessional resources, can be used most effectively to help our member countries, first of all, fill some parts of that 100 million predictable financing, but also importantly, unlock financing towards that 900 million gap. So we have been working for last about 1.5 years in 10 countries, very closely with ministries of finance, and we have colleagues from MEF over there in Cambodia, to understand what role ministries of finance and economy can play to bridge this gap. And there are 3 key maybe findings or insights that are emerging I can highlight. One is, if you really want to move from adaptation planning to implementation and fill this financing gap, you need a robust pipeline of adaptation projects. And this pipeline has to be strategic. The projects have to be well sequenced. Project, of course, has to be multi-sectoral and socially inclusive. But projects also need a very strong economic and financial rationale to be financed, actually. That's number one. A robust project pipeline is required. Second is you need to think about the funding and the financing of those projects. And I'm using the word deliberately different, funding and financing, because you want to make sure these projects can be upfront financed, either through grant or through debt or guarantee equity, whatever it is. Also, then how will you fund the project throughout its life cycle? So you think about this and then see for what project, what is the most appropriate financing? Because you will not have grant financing available for every single project in real world. So you really want to use the grant financing that Adaptation Fund provides most strategically to the things that nobody else will finance, but it's very critical, so supporting the vulnerable population or really unlocking opportunities for other financing. I think that is the second bit of really understanding the funding and the financing. And the third bit you need to work around is the policy space, because that 900 million gap cannot be funded through public finance. It has to be unlocking other sorts of private financing, including domestic private sector. So think about in the policy space, what kind of regulations might be required, what kind of incentive mechanism might be required, what kind of pricing might be required, so every single household, every single businesses or state-owned enterprises, they are all contributing towards adaptation. They may not call it adaptation finance, but they're contributing towards risk management adaptation. It's only when you have these 3 pieces of project pipeline, the funding and financing, and the policy space working together and hopefully feeding into each other, then perhaps you will have a stream of adaptation projects being implemented in the ground in a programmatic manner, and that has dependable financing backing it. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Agu. Very, very good set, let's say, contextualization for us to move to Bianca, who is in an adaptation fund, a key let's say, stakeholder fund for mobilizing resources for adaptation, especially in contexts where usually resources are not going through, as you mentioned, Argo. So Bianca, if you could share a little bit your experience, but also your thoughts on how we can scale up and bring in more finance where it's not going, especially the most challenging jurisdictions and also the most challenging projects, and what has been the experience of the adaptation fund in this matter.
Thank you, Joachim, and thank you to the NDC partnership for having us as a new member. Very pleased to join and also here at the event. And obviously, accelerating adaptation action and implementation of NDCs and NAPs and enhanced access to finance is really very close to our heart. It's the key mission and mandate of the Adaptation Fund. It's why it was set up. Yeah, happy to share some perspectives. And I liked what you shared, Joachim, in the beginning, the quantity, quality, and speed. And I think from what we bring as the Adaptation Fund is the quality of the adaptation finance. It was the first fund to operationalize direct access to finance, which contributes greatly to capacity building. More recently, we're promoting this locally led adaptation, so really this more devolved decision making to local stakeholders. So this is how we think about the quality. We're also funding innovation, learning, because we know this is ultimately what adaptation is. We bring the speed. Of course, as everybody knows, with the climate funds, sometimes it can be challenging to access. It is a certain business model that can take time, but compared to some of the other funds, because also we're funding smaller projects, it is faster to access. And so yes, we bring the quality and the speed, and of course the main challenge is the quantity. We will actually have our contributor dialogue later today, where we're hoping to mobilize and reach the board's resource mobilization target of 300 million. So with quite limited resources, I would say, we're doing a lot. So when it comes to NAPS and NDC implementation, we see that really funding these concrete interventions, they kickstart this whole process. Obviously, it cannot fund a whole NAP or NDC or even a whole sector. And so I appreciate also what you, Argo, were saying, but it's really about how to then strategically use that limited grant-based funding that is so valuable in the landscape to then access other sources of finance, for it to be scaled up by the MDBs to bring in other concessional but non-grant sources of funding, and so on. And this is where I think also the NDC partnership, or we're also working with UN4NAPS, you play an important role in bringing together these different funders and actors and helping to advise countries how to, what is out there, what is available. Even in the adaptation fund, we have then different windows. We now have a locally led adaptation window, we have an innovation window. So it's really looking at the strategic priorities in a NAP or an NDC and then seeing what can we use, which windows for what financing to really accelerate this. And we had this nice example even in Manila at the ADB Climate Adaptation Investment Planning Forum, and where Mongolia presented a case of what they would like to finance. We weren't quite sure at first, is it a regular project? And then we identified actually it's about innovation, it's about testing a new approach, test its viability. It's exactly what our innovation grants are doing. So yeah, we're really happy obviously to have all these conversations with countries, and are also looking forward to work with ADB, which is also our implementing entity, by the way. Other important actors in the capacity building space like Commonwealth Secretariat and NDC partnership. So maybe I'll end here for my pitch.
Thank you very much, Bianca, and we are really rooting for a very successful fundraising later today. So now I'd like to turn to Uzo. Uzo, you've been with the Climate Finance Access Hub, supporting many countries on the ground, embedding the advisors to build their capacities. There's a lot of focus in many of the countries you are working, SEEDs and LDCs, and mobilizing resources for adaptation. So maybe if you could share with us to setups for the discussion coming forward, a few key elements that you have learned in this process and where you think we should be putting more energy and more focus moving forward.
Sure, thank you so much, Joachim. And indeed, thanks to Agu and Bianca for really setting up this conversation nicely. And I'll tie it up. So where does the rubber hit the road in the countries? So at the Commonwealth Secretariat, we have our Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. And in itself, as Joachim was explaining, our modalities, the mode of operations is hubs and spokes. So we have our Commonwealth regional and Commonwealth national climate finance advisors embedded in country. So they work hand in hand together with the countries, usually located either in the ministries of environment or climate, now interestingly ministries of economic development and planning, and ministries of finance as well. We also have now thematic advisors on gender and health for climate finance. So you talked about socially inclusive projects on the ground, and this is so pertinent for adaptation projects. So in terms of when we look at the programmatic approach, what have we learned? So CIFA is going to be 10 years, and reflecting on this discussion today, we can see the wealth of experience because we've been in about 21 countries, we've deployed over 33 advisors, and with an initial seed funding of about 8 million, we've been able to leverage and support member countries access over 366 million US dollars. Now, in addition to the amount that we've helped our countries access, there's a whole wealth of capacity building behind that. We talked about the institutional processes, the policies. As an example, when you're looking at adaptation, especially, and I love the topic today that talks about aligning our NAPs and NDCs, critical. In the earlier years, we saw in our pipeline of projects, which you need to have, which we are developing, over 70% of our projects was adaptation, and rightly so, because it's demand-driven. We have over 30% of the seeds in the Commonwealth, and this is the reality on the ground. We need this funding, speed, scale, quality now. But just this year, reflecting on the portfolio, we found out that we now have about 45% adaptation, but 45% cross-cutting. So what we're seeing happening is that countries are actually understanding that it's not either or. You have to work together. You have to make sure the programmatic approaches are also aligning and building synergies across. So now what does that mean? When it comes to the work that we do in terms of getting the projects off the ground, how do we do it? As I mentioned, we have our Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisors embedded in country. I'm pleased to highlight we have Eric here, representing from Namibia. We also have Ankita in HQ. We have realized that we cannot work in silos. We always hear this. But even within countries, silos is not only within the ministries, but the sectors themselves. When our advisors go into the countries, they have to do like a climate finance landscape assessment. And then that feeds into looking at either working on the new climate finance strategy or building on the existing ones. And then working with the relevant stakeholders. So again, there's also a matching in terms of the types of projects themselves and the types of financing instruments for those projects. Now, especially when it comes to adaptation, advisors have a strong coordination hat. They work on every sector, but when they're working on agriculture, you would have to work with the ministries of water as well, energy, etc. So that's important. They bring them together. So that's one level of engagement. Now, in terms of the pipeline development itself, that is critical. They do that, but building with the relevant stakeholders in country. There's also the element of climate finance right shops that we do, whereby it's really intensive, over a period of at least 2 to 3 days, but consecutively within that year, 2 years, as long as it takes for us to have a tangible output, working with the key stakeholders to have the bankable projects, as were mentioned. Now, this is so important. It's something that we cannot underestimate at all. And in that process, we work with the countries, with the stakeholders themselves, And when we say the partners, we also do the investment roundtables. And we make sure that we align with the requirements of whatever funding body, be it adaptation fund, the Green Climate Fund, etc., to make sure that we're meeting their requirements. You know, of course, the financial instruments I've mentioned, but also the inclusivity aspect. We need to make sure it's working for the communities on the ground, whereby it's gender responsive and also youth considered as well. In fact, most of the funding lines these days, you always need to have a gender and climate action plan before you can access funding. And I think one other key element to highlight is the policy landscape, as Ago had mentioned earlier. A key example in terms of what we do is to look at the alignment with the national budget cycles. Now, especially for adaptation, but of course mitigation, climate action in general, it has to be aligned with national development priorities. And again, that journey, you have to work together with the relevant line ministries, especially ministries of finance or economic development and planning. We have our advisors working perhaps like 3 days sometimes in the ministries of environment and 2 days with ministries of finance. So this is really working well. And working to ensure that we have the climate public expenditure and institutional reviews, as well as the budget cycles, budget tagging, and bringing in the private sector. And that way, we can make sure we use public finance to leverage the most needed private sector finance to meet the volume and quantity as we've mentioned. So I think with the experience that we've had, I'd just like to say we've rounded off by capturing all of this in our Commonwealth Climate Finance Essentials Toolkit. It just builds on this practical example, step by step, over these 10 years that we've worked with our advisors. And it's on the UNFCCC website, NDC partnership website as well. And the best part is we've launched the e-learning toolkit, so it's self-paced, and you'd also get a certification at the end. One thing to highlight is that when our advisors are in country, they also have experts shadowing them because of that continuity. I will end by saying capacity is not only the human aspect, the institutional aspect, which ties in the programmatic approaches, ties in the stakeholders, ties in the financing. You need to have, for example, in Fiji, we set up the project development unit. In Belize, we set up the climate finance unit. And working together in partnership is key. So we work together with all the partners here at the table. So quite excited for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uzo, for bringing a lot of color and kind of specificity for the topics that were outlined before in terms of the three elements. I think the way that Argo outlined them, Bianca gave more specifics on the financing side, on the quality side, and also you with the capacity elements. So this was all to basically set the scene. The idea now is really to discuss and to have an interactive exchange. And for that, we are going to have 3 groups. So the experts that just presented, there will be 3 different groups, and we will invite you to join them in one of the tables. You can either stay for the entire, let's say we will have now, 15 minutes, 15, 18 minutes in one table, or if you want to rotate as well. The idea is to really have a discussion, hear from you, hear experiences, your challenges, ask questions, so really exchange amongst each other. So there will be 3 tables. The first one will be on capacity development and institutional strengthening for adaptation, and that's where we will have Uzo sitting. So she will be going to one of the tables. Those interested in having discussion, please join her. The second one will be on the programmatic approaches for adaptation investment planning, and that's we are going to have Argo facilitating the discussions. And the third one will be catalyzing external financing for enhanced climate adaptation action. And then we have Bianca leading that particular group. So the idea is really for us to have around 15 minutes for discussion. Then we will wrap up, hear some of the key messages, but then also think on avenues and ways for us to continue working and improving this type of approach and exchanges. So please join them, yeah. And thank you very much for joining and for sharing your expertise. Yeah. So just you could sit one in each of the tables. And maybe as you sit, and also to kick off the discussion, we have put it some suggestions or some questions for each of the tables. So the first table, the table on capacity development and institutional strengthening, where we have Uzo. The idea is really to try to explore what have been the practices and experiences that have been shown to build strong institutional capacity for adaptation within the government or a specific organization. What are the challenges that the countries are facing in terms of data availability and incorporating it into adaptation, programming and investment, and what are the resources and support that are needed to strengthen institutional capacities. The second one, where Argo is sitting, the idea is to explore what have been the most successful approaches in aligning adaptation investment planning with national and subnational objectives. What are the primary challenges that have been encountered, but also very importantly, what have been the funding models and the solutions that have been put in place to facilitate this process. And the third one on catalyzing finance. So what are the strategies that have been more effective in mobilizing and securing finance for our climate adaptation initiatives? What are the key challenges that have been encountered in this process? And what type of partnerships, technical assistance, or capacity building measures could improve access to climate finance? So this is just let's say a suggestion of topics. So really, yeah, suggesting you to go ahead, and then I will let you know when we are in the time for wrap up. So sorry to interrupt. I see that the discussions are quite lively in the groups, but as we have, I think, another 5 to 7 minutes before we leave, because another event will take place. So I would suggest just to have a quick wrap up. So I will pass the word to each of the table leads for giving us a quick overview of what was discussed and key elements that we could take out of this discussion. So to kick us off, I will pass the word to Uzo, just to give a quick recap of what you discussed, and yeah, 2 to 3 minutes, so then we can later wrap up the discussion.
So this has been really exciting, and let me just start by saying we've just had a Malaysia to Namibia cross-exchange of information, because knowledge sharing is really important when it comes to capacity. That's one key element. But things we talked about, let me quickly go through. The first question: what best practices have proven effective in building institutional capacity for adaptation finance within your government or organization? So the example we had from Namibia was the establishment of a climate finance working group, whereby they work together with a cohort of stakeholders. Collective training is happening. They are building that inherent human capacity, yes, making sure there's coordination across ministries, avoiding duplication of efforts, and it's cost effective. So that was a good example. And then building on that, the example we got from Mozambique was to say they've done something similar, but more from an energy transition point of view, but it is able to translate into adaptation, finance, investment planning. And they said they had really good success in this regard, whereby they had buy-in from the highest level for this task force. So in terms of the institutional processes here, we see a trend. Either you call it a working group, a task force, but the most important thing is to have highest level buy-in, good representation across all ministries, but also having people that have access. So you have the technical people speaking, but maybe people that sit in the steering committees that have access to higher powers up. And then multi-sectoral, really key, especially for adaptation. Strategic planning, really key. Another thing when it comes to the institutional processes is there's the people and there's the systems. So how do you ensure you have a dedicated team? This came up from Malaysia. And then we heard in Namibia how that you incentivize. You can actually look at it like carrot or stick, but make sure it's mandated. So and I think this is relevant not only for adaptation, but climate action in general. It should not be an add-on. You need to have staff having this embedded within their work plans, performance appraisals, etc. Now, moving on, what are the key challenges countries face in improving availability and incorporating it into adaptation finance planning? This one is so crucial for adaptation because you do not have standard metrics, especially like how you have in mitigation. It's usually over a longer period of time when you measure outcomes. Again, there's a sustainability factor, linking again to what we were talking about, capacity. You could have people moving on, and then what happens to institutional memories? Do you have the platforms in place, the processes in place, the systems in place to capture when you do monitoring and evaluation, to then feed into the planning cycle in itself? So again, a dedicated team was really highlighted, the accounting processes, the MRV for adaptation. You need to have all of that in place such that you're not just capturing the data, but analyzing it and making sure that you can use that data to inform decision making. So let me pause and ask anybody else on the table quickly.
Just reinforcing one point that she's already made. Access to the information, it's scattered in different laptops, computers, sometimes in hard copies. We don't have online platforms that are accessible, people to access the data and be able to use it for decision-making, planning, and the rest of that.
No, thank you very much, and it's amazing how you managed to cover so many different topics, yes. Then I'll turn to Bianca for also a quick.
Thank you.